"Ma'am, step away from the entrance before I make you." The voice cracked across the humid Georgia afternoon like a warning siren, sharp enough to turn heads all along the gas station parking lot. Naomi Brooks froze beside the ice freezer, one hand gripping a brown paper bag filled with cough medicine, canned soup, and a loaf of wheat bread already damp from the summer heat. The smell of gasoline and hot asphalt clung to the air, while thunder rumbled somewhere far beyond the shopping plaza. Slowly, she turned toward the flashing patrol lights reflecting across the store windows. Officer Tyler Boone stepped out of his cruiser with one hand resting near his belt, his mirrored sunglasses hiding whatever judgment sat behind his eyes. Naomi looked exhausted, and exhaustion had weight. It sagged from her shoulders, darkened the skin beneath her eyes, and clung to the faded gray hoodie covering the blue scrubs she still wore underneath. Now all she wanted was 10 quiet minutes before heading home to check on her father. But Officer Boone wasn't looking at her like a tired nurse. He looked at her like a problem. "Sir, I already paid," Naomi said softly, lifting the receipt slightly with trembling fingers. Boone glanced at the wrinkled paper but didn't move closer to read it. Behind Naomi, a teenager standing near the soda machine pulled out his phone. Another customer slowed beside the gas pumps, curiosity spreading across his face. The world always seemed to stop when public humiliation started. Boone's jaw tightened. "Then why are employees saying you've been standing around outside for 20 minutes bothering customers?" Naomi blinked slowly. "I was sitting because my legs cramped up." Sweat slid down her neck beneath the hood, while distant sirens echoed somewhere across town. "Officer, I'm just trying to go home." But Boone was already walking toward the side of the cruiser where a coiled utility hose sat attached beside emergency equipment. The movement confused her at first. Then fear crept coldly into her stomach. "Sir," Naomi's voice faltered. "Don't do this." Boone grabbed the nozzle and pointed it toward the pavement near her feet. "Move along." The first burst of water exploded across the concrete with enough force to splash icy spray against Naomi's legs. Gasps rippled through the parking lot. Someone laughed nervously. Naomi stumbled backward, clutching the paper bag tighter against her chest. A second blast hit harder this time, soaking her hoodie instantly and sending canned soup rolling across the pavement. The brown paper tore apart beneath the pressure. Medicine bottles bounced into dirty rainwater pooled near the curb. Naomi sucked in a breath but didn't scream. She stood there shaking while water streamed from her braids and dripped from her eyelashes onto the burning concrete below. Teenager filming lowered his phone slightly, uncertainty replacing amusement. Boone stepped forward again, voice cold and controlled. "I said leave." Naomi looked around at the staring faces, at the glowing red and blue lights washing over the storefront windows, at the groceries floating slowly through the gutter beside her shoes. Then somewhere inside the patrol car behind Boone, a small violent cough shattered the noise of rushing water. Naomi's expression changed instantly. The cough came again, harsher this time, followed by the faint sound of desperate wheezing from inside the patrol car. Naomi turned immediately, every muscle in her exhausted body tightening at once. That was not a normal cough. She had heard that sound too many times under fluorescent hospital lights at 3 o'clock in the morning, while terrified parents stood helpless beside emergency beds. Officer Boone either did not recognize it or chose to ignore it. "Eyes on me," he snapped, lifting the hose slightly again. But Naomi was no longer looking at him. Her eyes locked onto the back seat of the cruiser where movement flickered behind tinted glass. A small silhouette leaned sideways against the door. Another strained cough rattled through the humid air. Naomi took a slow step forward. "There is a child in your car." Boone moved into her path instantly. "That is none of your business." Naomi's soaked hoodie clung heavily to her arms while water dripped steadily from her fingertips onto the pavement. Around them, the parking lot had gone strangely quiet. Even the teenager filming lowered his phone completely now. Something in Naomi's face had changed. The humiliation was gone. In its place was focus. Sharp. Urgent. "Officer," she said carefully, trying to steady her breathing. "Your son cannot get enough air." Boone's jaw flexed hard beneath the reflection of flashing lights. "You do not know what you are talking about." But another sound came from inside the cruiser. A weak choking gasp. Naomi's stomach dropped instantly. "How old is he?" she asked. Boone hesitated for half a second too long. 8, he muttered. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. 8-year-old lungs. Smaller airway. Faster oxygen loss. Her pulse kicked hard in her throat. Open the door. Step back. Open the door now. The authority in her voice startled everyone, including Boone himself. Naomi stepped sideways, trying to see through the darkened window. Inside, she caught a glimpse of a young boy curled awkwardly against the seatbelt, one hand pressed against his chest. His skin looked pale even through the glass. He is struggling to breathe, Naomi said. I need to see him. Boone shook his head immediately, fear flashing across his face for the first time. He has asthma. He is fine. Naomi's eyes narrowed. No, he is not. Thunder rolled louder overhead now, closer than before. The wind shifted through the gas station canopy, carrying the metallic smell of incoming rain. Boone glanced toward the cruiser, and in that tiny moment of distraction, Naomi saw panic crack through the hard shell of his expression. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Another violent cough echoed from inside the vehicle, followed by silence. Naomi's heartbeat stopped cold. Silence was worse. Much worse. Officer Boone. Her voice softened suddenly. Please. The way she said please did not sound submissive. It sounded human. Honest. Tired. Boone looked at her soaked clothes, the trembling hands, the grocery cans floating through dirty rainwater near her feet. Then he looked back toward the patrol car. His breathing became shallow. He forgot his inhaler this morning. He admitted quietly, almost to himself. Naomi moved closer again. How long has he been coughing? Boone swallowed hard. About 10 minutes. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. And you left him in the car? Shame flickered across his face so quickly it almost disappeared beneath the red and blue reflections washing over the windshield. He had only stopped for 5 minutes. Just long enough to grab coffee. Just long enough to deal with what he thought was another disturbance call. Just long enough for everything to go wrong. Naomi heard a faint tapping against the cruiser window from inside. Weak. Unsteady. Without thinking anymore, she shoved past Boone and grabbed the rear passenger handle. Locked. Open it, she shouted. Boone stepped forward instinctively. Do not touch my vehicle. Then the boy inside made a sound Naomi would never forget. A small, desperate gasp that barely sounded human anymore. Her trauma training took over instantly. If you waste another second, she said, turning toward Boone with water dripping from her face like rain, your son could stop breathing completely. For a moment, Officer Boone did not move. The flashing patrol lights painted red and blue streaks across the wet pavement, while distant thunder rolled over the shopping plaza like something heavy dragging across the sky. Naomi could hear the boy struggling, now even through the closed door. Fast, shallow breaths. Tiny, desperate pauses between each inhale. She had heard children sound like that before. Sometimes they survived. Sometimes they did not. Unlock the car, she said again. Lower this time, but far more dangerous. Boone's fingers tightened around the hose nozzle hanging uselessly at his side. Water still dripped steadily from it onto the concrete. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even the gas pumps seemed quieter somehow. Boone finally reached for his key fob with trembling hands. The locks clicked open. Naomi pulled the rear door wide immediately. Hot trapped air spilled out from inside the cruiser, carrying the sharp smell of sweat, plastic, and fast food wrappers. The little boy sat slumped awkwardly against the seatbelt, his small chest jerking unevenly beneath a wrinkled soccer jersey. His lips had faded toward gray. Fear hit Naomi hard enough to make her stomach twist. Hey, sweetheart, she said softly, kneeling beside the seat. Can you hear me? The boy looked toward her weakly. His eyes were glossy with panic. Dad, he whispered hoarsely before another cough shook through his chest. Naomi turned instantly toward Boone. Call an ambulance now. Boone already had his radio in hand, but his movements looked clumsy suddenly, disconnected from the confident officer who had controlled the parking lot only minutes earlier. Dispatch, he said sharply into the microphone, though his voice cracked halfway through. I need EMS at the Quick Fuel on Madison Avenue. Pediatric respiratory emergency. Naomi gently loosened the child's seatbelt and checked his breathing. Too fast. Too shallow. The humid air wrapped around all of them like wet cloth while sweat rolled down Boone's temple beneath his short blonde hair. What is his name? Naomi asked. Ethan, Boone answered immediately. Naomi nodded once. Okay, Ethan. Listen to me. I need you to take slow breaths for me. All right? You are doing good. Ethan tried. His tiny shoulders trembled with effort. Naomi glanced around the back seat quickly. No inhaler. No spacer. Nothing. Where is his medication? Boone looked stricken. At home. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Frustration flared hot inside her chest. But there was no room for anger right now. Not when a child needed air. She reached into her soaked tote bag, lying beside the curb among the ruined groceries. Her fingers moved fast through damp paperwork, loose pens, snack wrappers from overnight shifts, and finally closed around a small red pouch. Boone stared at her as she unzipped it carefully. Inside sat basic emergency medical supplies, sealed in waterproof packaging. A portable oxygen mask, pediatric airway tubing, gloves. The teenager near the gas pumps whispered under his breath, stunned. Naomi barely noticed. She slipped on gloves with calm, efficient movements, while rain finally began falling in soft, warm drops from the darkening sky above. Boone watched every motion she made now with the rigid attention of a man realizing he had made a terrible mistake. Naomi adjusted the small oxygen mask over Ethan's face gently. "Good job, baby," she whispered as the child clung weakly to her wrist. "Stay with me." Boone stared at the medical pouch in disbelief. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Naomi did not answer right away. She was focused on Ethan's breathing, on the tiny sounds inside his lungs, on the pulse fluttering beneath fragile skin. Another rumble of thunder shook the sky overhead while rainwater dripped from the ends of Naomi's braids onto the patrol car floorboards. Then Boone's eyes fell toward the open wallet half exposed inside Naomi's soaked bag. Clipped beside her hospital identification card sat a silver trauma certification badge from Atlanta Children's Medical Center. Boone's face lost color instantly. Rain began falling harder across the parking lot, turning the flashing police lights into blurry streaks of red and blue against the wet pavement. Naomi stayed kneeling beside Ethan, one hand steady against the oxygen mask while the other checked the pulse at his wrist again. Still fast, still weak, but slightly better. Barely. The boy's frightened eyes remained locked on her face, like she was the only stable thing left in the world. Officer Boone stood frozen beside the open cruiser door, rain soaking through his uniform shirt as if he no longer noticed the weather at all. His eyes kept drifting back toward the silver trauma certification clipped inside Naomi's open wallet. Atlanta Children's Medical Center. Pediatric Trauma Unit. The words seemed to hit him harder than any accusation could have. A few minutes earlier, he had sprayed her with water in front of strangers like she was less than human. Now his son was breathing through equipment pulled from her own emergency kit. Boone swallowed hard. "You work at Children's?" Naomi adjusted Ethan's mask carefully before answering. "Night shift." Her voice sounded tired now. Not angry, just tired in a way that reached deeper than exhaustion. The rain tapped softly against the cruiser roof while the smell of wet asphalt rose into the humid evening air. Somewhere across the street, traffic crawled slowly past the gas station, drivers craning their necks toward the flashing lights and gathering crowd. Boone looked down at his son. "He has attacks sometimes," he admitted quietly. "Usually I can calm him down before it gets bad." Naomi glanced at him briefly. "Stress makes asthma worse." Boone nodded once, shame tightening visibly across his face. Ethan shifted weakly against the seat, his tiny fingers gripping Naomi's soaked sleeve. "Am I gonna die?" he whispered through the mask. The question cut through the parking lot like broken glass. Boone's entire body stiffened. Naomi leaned closer immediately. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "You are not dying. Your lungs are just working extra hard right now, okay? But I need you to keep breathing with me." Ethan tried to nod. Naomi demonstrated slow breaths for him, steady and calm despite the rainwater dripping from her braids onto the seat beneath them. In the distance, faint ambulance sirens finally echoed through the storm. Boone exhaled shakily at the sound, but Naomi's focus did not shift. She watched Ethan closely, counting each breath in her head the same way she had done hundreds of times in crowded emergency rooms under fluorescent lights. The teenager who had been filming earlier slowly stepped closer, lowering his phone completely now. "Miss," he said awkwardly. "I got all of it on video." Boone looked up sharply. The teenager hesitated beneath the officer's stare, but continued anyway. "The hose. Everything." Rain rolled down the boy's face while uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. Naomi remained still for a moment before finally speaking without looking up. "Do not post it." The teenager blinked in surprise. But he looked down at the scattered groceries still floating near the curb. Crushed soup cans, ruined bread, a soaked bottle of cough medicine meant for someone waiting at home. Boone's chest tightened painfully. "Why did you not tell me who you were?" he asked quietly. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward him. Rain shimmered across her face beneath the flashing patrol lights. Would it have mattered? Boone opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. Before the badge, before the trauma certification, before he realized she could save his son, he had already decided who she was the moment he saw her standing outside that store in a wet hoodie with tired eyes and dark skin. The ambulance sirens grew louder now, closing in fast through the rain. Ethan coughed weakly again and tightened his grip around Naomi's sleeve. "Please do not go," he whispered. The ambulance pulled into the gas station parking lot with red lights slicing through the rain like flashes of lightning. Two paramedics jumped out immediately, their boots splashing through shallow puddles as they rolled a stretcher toward the cruiser. Naomi stayed beside Ethan until the very last second, one hand still resting gently against the oxygen mask while the little boy struggled to keep his eyes open. "You are doing good, baby," she whispered again. "Just keep breathing for me." Ethan looked terrified now, not because of the storm or the ambulance or the strangers rushing toward him, but because his small fingers were still wrapped tightly around Naomi's soaked sleeve. "Please come with me," he said weakly. Naomi's expression softened instantly. "I cannot ride with you, sweetheart. Please." The word barely came out louder than the rain. Officer Boone stood frozen beside the open cruiser door, watching his son cling to the same woman he had humiliated less than 20 minutes earlier. The sight seemed to crush something inside him. One paramedic knelt beside Ethan quickly while the other checked the oxygen setup Naomi had improvised from her emergency kit. "Who started treatment?" Paramedic asked. "I did," Naomi answered calmly. The man glanced at her trauma certification clipped beside her hospital badge and immediately nodded with professional respect. "Good call on the oxygen support." Boone lowered his head slightly at those words. Respect. Recognition. Everything he had refused to give her earlier was now coming naturally from complete strangers. The paramedics carefully transferred Ethan onto the stretcher while rainwater dripped steadily from the gas station canopy overhead. Ethan panicked the second Naomi stepped back. "No," he gasped weakly. "Do not leave." Naomi immediately moved beside him again, placing a reassuring hand against his shoulder. "Look at me," she said softly. "You are safe now." Ethan's breathing steadied slightly at the sound of her voice alone. One paramedic looked toward Boone. "Sir, are you riding with us?" Rain slid down his face, mixing with something else he clearly did not want the crowd around him to see. Regret sat heavily in his expression now, impossible to hide beneath authority or uniform or pride. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Words failed him completely. Naomi looked exhausted beyond measure. Her hoodie clung to her skin. Wet braids rested against her shoulders. Her ruined groceries still floated near the curb beneath flashing police lights. Boone finally forced himself to speak. "Miss Brooks," his voice cracked slightly. But Naomi shook her head gently before he could finish. "Not angry, not dramatic, just tired. Go be with your son." Crowds slowly began drifting away now that the emergency had passed. Some looked ashamed for watching. Others avoided Naomi's eyes completely. The teenager who filmed everything stood awkwardly beside the gas pumps holding his phone at his side. "Miss Brooks?" he asked quietly. Naomi bent down slowly beside the curb and started picking up what remained of her groceries. The bread was ruined. The soup cans dented. The medicine bottle cracked open from hitting the pavement. "You really do not want me posting that video?" Teenager asked again carefully. Naomi paused for a moment, rain dripping steadily from her fingertips. "People already know how quickly humiliation spreads online," she said softly. "They do not need another reminder." The boy lowered his eyes immediately. Naomi gathered the last crushed grocery item into the torn paper bag before finally standing again. Her body ached now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked toward the empty road where the ambulance had disappeared. Then slowly, almost absent-mindedly, she rubbed the sore spot on her arm where the force of the water hose had struck earlier. Voice suddenly called out behind her. "Miss Brooks." Naomi turned slowly. A black SUV had just pulled into the lot beside the flashing patrol car. And stepping out into the rain was a tall gray-haired man wearing a police captain's uniform. The rain softened into a cold, steady drizzle as the black SUV rolled to a stop beside the patrol cruiser, its headlights cutting pale beams across the wet parking lot. Naomi straightened slowly, clutching the torn grocery bag against her chest while water dripped from the sleeves of her soaked hoodie. Every muscle in her body felt heavy now. The adrenaline that had carried her through Ethan's emergency was fading fast, leaving behind exhaustion deep enough to ache in her bones. The gray-haired officer stepping from the SUV moved with calm authority, the kind built from decades instead of ego. Captain Harold Mercer glanced once at the abandoned hose lying near the curb, once at the soaked groceries floating through puddles, and then finally at Naomi herself. His expression tightened almost immediately. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I am Captain Mercer." Naomi gave a small nod, but said nothing. She was too tired for introductions. Mercer looked toward the teenager still standing near the gas pumps. Was somebody recording? The boy hesitated before slowly lifting his phone. "Yes, sir." Mercer extended his hand calmly. "May I see it?" The teenager glanced nervously between Naomi and the captain before finally walking over and handing him the phone. Rain tapped softly against the SUV roof while Mercer watched several seconds of the footage in silence. Naomi could not see the screen, but she did not need to. She remembered every second already. The blast of water, the laughter, the look in Boone's eyes before he realized who she truly was. Mercer lowered the phone slowly. His jaw flexed once beneath the gray stubble lining his face. "How long has Officer Boone been on solo duty?" he asked without looking up. One of the younger officers who had arrived with the SUV shifted uncomfortably. "About 6 months since his transfer from Midtown." Mercer nodded faintly, and nobody thought to mention the complaints. She said softly, "Your apology will not change what happened." Mercer accepted the words without defensiveness, maybe because he knew she was right. The parking lot smelled like rainwater and gasoline now, the storm washing away heat and noise alike. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer glanced down at the ruined groceries in her arms. "You saved that boy's life after what was done to you here tonight." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the torn paper bag. "He is a child." Mercer studied her carefully then, not just her soaked clothes or exhausted posture, but the quiet steadiness behind her eyes. The kind of steadiness that did not come from titles or uniforms. It came from surviving things people never saw. Most people would have walked away, Mercer admitted. Naomi let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Most people do." Thunder rolled softly in the distance while rainwater trickled through the parking lot gutters carrying scraps of soaked paper and dirt toward the storm drains. One of the younger officers approached carefully holding a dry blanket from the SUV emergency kit. "Ma'am," he offered awkwardly. Naomi hesitated before accepting it quietly. The warmth surprised her more than it should have. Mercer glanced toward Boone's abandoned patrol cruiser, then back toward the teenager still standing silently beside the pumps. "Do not delete that video," the captain said firmly. Naomi looked at him immediately. Mercer met her gaze with calm honesty. "Some silence protects people," he said quietly. "Other silence protects problems." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. Somewhere deep inside the stormy night, she realized this was the first officer who had truly looked at her all evening and seen a person instead of an assumption. Mercer reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out a business card. "Tomorrow morning," he said gently. "Internal Affairs is going to ask questions about tonight." Then Mercer added one final sentence in a voice barely louder than the storm. "And after seeing that footage, I think Officer Boone already knows his life is about to change forever." The rain had almost stopped by the time Naomi finally reached her apartment building on the south side of Atlanta. The city streets glistened beneath yellow streetlights while water dripped steadily from power lines overhead. Her body felt heavier with every step up the cracked concrete stairs leading to the second-floor unit she shared with her father. The blanket Captain Mercer had given her hung loosely around her shoulders, still carrying the faint smell of rain and police leather. Inside apartment 2B, soft jazz played quietly from an old radio near the kitchen window. Naomi pushed the door open slowly and found her father asleep in his recliner beneath a faded blue blanket, reading glasses tilted sideways on his chest. The sight hit her harder than she expected. Simple, peaceful, human, the kind of thing people with power often overlooked. Naomi quietly set the ruined grocery bag on the kitchen counter. The bread was soaked through completely. The cough medicine bottle had cracked enough to leak sticky syrup down the side of the bag. She stared at it silently for a moment before finally lowering herself into a chair beside the sink. Her hands would not stop trembling now that the night was finally quiet. The apartment smelled like old books, coffee grounds, and the lavender lotion her father used for arthritis pain. Familiar smells. Safe smells. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Then her phone buzzed against the counter. One notification. Then another. Then 5 more in rapid succession. Her stomach tightened immediately. Slowly, she picked up the phone. The teenager had uploaded the video after all. Not the entire incident. Just the moment she rushed toward Ethan and pulled medical supplies from her soaked bag, while Officer Boone stood frozen beside the cruiser. Millions of views already. Thousands of comments flooding in faster than the screen could refresh. Some praised her calm. Others condemned Boone. Some argued. Some defended. The internet had already turned the worst night of her week into spectacle. Naomi set the phone face down immediately. She felt exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. Another knock suddenly echoed at the apartment door. Sharp. Hesitant. Naomi stiffened slightly before walking over and opening it carefully. Captain Mercer stood in the hallway alone beneath the flickering overhead light. He looked older now somehow. Tired around the eyes. "I am sorry for showing up this late," he said quietly. Naomi stepped aside without speaking. Mercer entered slowly, removing his rain-damp cap in his hands. His gaze drifted briefly toward the ruined groceries on the counter before returning to Naomi. "Ethan is stable," he said first. Naomi exhaled softly at the words. Relief passed through her face so quickly it almost disappeared. Mercer noticed anyway. Officer Boone stayed at the hospital. Naomi nodded once. "Good." Mercer reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Internal Affairs suspended him tonight, pending investigation." Naomi looked at the paper but made no move to take it. Outside the apartment window, distant sirens echoed through the wet Atlanta streets while headlights slid across rain-covered pavement below. "That video spread faster than anybody expected," Mercer admitted carefully. "The mayor already called the department twice." Naomi leaned against the kitchen counter slowly. "People are angry." Mercer studied her for a moment. "And you?" Naomi looked toward her sleeping father in the other room before answering. "I am tired." The honesty in her voice settled heavily into the apartment silence. Mercer nodded faintly like he understood more than he wanted to admit. Then he reached into his pocket again and placed something small onto the counter between them. Officer Boone's body camera badge. Naomi frowned slightly. "Why are you showing me this?" Mercer's expression darkened. "Because Boone turned in his official report tonight." Naomi waited silently. Mercer's jaw tightened once. He admitted everything. Naomi blinked slowly. That part surprised her. Most people protected themselves first, especially people with authority. Mercer lowered his voice carefully. "But there is something else you need to know." Naomi looked up. Rainwater still tapped softly against the apartment windows while the old jazz station crackled quietly from the radio. Mercer hesitated for the first time all evening. "Before tonight," he said slowly, "Officer Boone had already requested a transfer out of patrol." Naomi frowned slightly. "Why?" Mercer looked toward the floor for a brief moment before answering. "Because after his wife died last year, he started reporting panic episodes while responding to calls involving children." Naomi's expression changed instantly. Naomi stared at Captain Mercer without speaking while the old jazz record crackled softly through the apartment. Rain slid down the windows in thin silver lines, blurring the city lights outside into hazy streaks of gold and red. The apartment suddenly felt smaller somehow, quieter too. "Panic episodes?" she repeated carefully. Mercer nodded once, exhaustion weighing heavily across his face now. After his wife passed from cancer last winter, Boone started unraveling. Naomi looked away toward the kitchen counter where the cracked bottle of cough medicine still leaked slowly onto wet paper. "A lot of people lose someone," she said quietly. "They do not all humiliate strangers in parking lots." Mercer accepted the words without argument. "You are right." Silence settled again. The radio hummed softly in the background while Naomi's father shifted in his recliner, still asleep beneath the faded blanket. Mercer lowered his voice. "I am not here to excuse what happened tonight." Naomi crossed her arms slowly against the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Then why are you here?" Mercer hesitated before answering. Because Boone asked me to bring you something. Naomi frowned slightly. The captain reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a folded photograph. Rainwater had curled the edges slightly. He placed it gently on the counter between them. Naomi looked down. It was Ethan standing beside a woman with bright eyes and curly blonde hair outside a Little League baseball field. The boy could not have been older than 6 in the picture. His smile looked effortless back then, alive in the easy way children should be. Naomi's chest tightened unexpectedly. That is his mother, Mercer said quietly. Claire Boone. Naomi studied the photograph silently. Ethan looked so different, healthy and laughing beneath bright summer sunlight, instead of gasping for air beneath flashing police lights. Mercer continued carefully. According to Boone, Ethan started having severe asthma attacks after Claire died. He blames himself for not catching her illness sooner. Says every time Ethan struggles to breathe now, he hears his wife in that hospital room all over again. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Hospital grief. She knew that sound too well. Families carried it forever. Mercer looked down at his hands. Tonight, when he saw Ethan in that cruiser, his voice trailed off. He panicked before you ever did. Naomi opened her eyes slowly. And because he panicked, he saw me as dangerous. Mercer did not answer immediately because they both already knew the truth. Fear had shaped Boone long before tonight. But fear mixed with power became something uglier. Something harmful. Naomi finally picked up the photograph carefully. Water stains blurred one corner where Boone must have held it with wet hands. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were the words, Ethan's first home run. Summer 2022. Naomi swallowed hard. He loves his son. Mercer nodded immediately. More than anything. Naomi stared at the smiling woman in the photograph again. That does not erase what he did. No, Mercer admitted quietly. It does not. The apartment fell silent except for rain and distant traffic below the building. Then Mercer reached into his coat one final time and removed a sealed envelope. Boone wrote this at the hospital tonight. Naomi frowned slightly. A statement. Mercer shook his head. No, he slid the envelope across the counter carefully. Naomi stared at her name written across the front in uneven handwriting. The letters looked rushed. Shaking. Emotional. He asked me to deliver it personally. Naomi did not touch it immediately. She looked tired beyond words now, emotionally hollowed out from the weight of the entire night. You do not have to read it, Mercer said gently. Naomi finally picked up the envelope. The paper felt damp from rain, heavy somehow. She opened it slowly and unfolded a single handwritten page. Her eyes moved silently across the words while the jazz station crackled softly in the background. Halfway through reading, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not forgiveness, not softness, something quieter. Sadness maybe. Mercer watched carefully, but did not interrupt. Finally, Naomi lowered the letter slowly. He said Ethan asked for me twice after reaching the hospital. Mercer nodded faintly. The boy would not calm down until Boone promised he would find you. Naomi looked down at the letter again while rainwater tapped gently against the apartment windows. Then in a voice barely louder than the storm outside, she asked the one question Mercer clearly had not expected. Is Ethan still awake? The children's hospital smelled like antiseptic, warm blankets, and burnt coffee from vending machines that had probably been running all night. Naomi walked quietly beside Captain Mercer through the pale blue hallway while fluorescent lights reflected softly across polished floors beneath their feet. Her hoodie was finally dry now, replaced by clean navy scrubs borrowed from the hospital staff lounge downstairs, but exhaustion still followed her like weight tied to her shoulders. Outside Ethan's room, Mercer stopped. You do not owe anybody in their forgiveness, he said gently. Naomi looked through the narrow window in the door first. Ethan lay propped up against white pillows beneath a dinosaur blanket, oxygen tubing resting beneath his nose now instead of the emergency mask. He looked small. Smaller than she remembered from the cruiser. Beside the bed sat Officer Boone, wearing the same damp uniform from earlier, though his shoulders no longer carried authority. Just fatigue. Guilt. Boone looked up the second Naomi stepped into the doorway. His expression changed instantly, relief and shame crashing together across his face, so openly it almost hurt to witness. He stood immediately. Miss Brooks. Naomi held up her hand softly before he could continue. How is he? Her attention stayed on Ethan. Not Boone. Never Boone first. Ethan's tired eyes brightened immediately when he saw her. You came. Naomi walked closer slowly. I said you were going to be okay, remember? Ethan gave a weak smile beneath the oxygen tubing. Dad said you saved me. Naomi glanced briefly toward Boone before pulling a chair beside the hospital bed. The paramedics helped too. Ethan shook his head slightly. No. Before them. The room fell quiet after that. Hospital machines hummed softly in the background while rain tapped faintly against the windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Boone stood near the corner of the room like a man unsure whether he deserved to exist inside it anymore. Naomi adjusted Ethan's blanket gently where it had slipped near his shoulder. You scared your father tonight, she whispered softly. Ethan looked toward Boone. He cries when he thinks I am asleep. Boone lowered his head immediately. Naomi's chest tightened painfully at the small, honest sentence. Children always saw more than adults believed. Ethan reached slowly beneath his blanket and pulled out something folded carefully in tiny hands. A crayon drawing. He handed it toward Naomi shyly. I made this while waiting for you. Naomi unfolded the paper slowly. It showed a stick-figure woman standing in the rain beside flashing red lights with one arm stretched protectively toward a little boy. The woman wore a bright yellow cape colored unevenly outside the lines. Naomi stared at the drawing in silence. Then Ethan pointed at the figure, smiling proudly. That is you. Boone turned away suddenly toward the dark hospital window, pressing one hand against his mouth as emotion finally cracked through him completely. Naomi looked down at the drawing again, while soft machine beeps echoed steadily around the room. I am not a superhero, Ethan. The little boy frowned slightly. Then why did you help us after Dad was mean to you? The question hung in the hospital room, so quietly it almost felt sacred. Boone closed his eyes. Naomi sat very still for a moment, staring at the crooked yellow cape on the paper in her hands. Finally, she answered in the gentlest voice Boone had ever heard. Because pain does not get smaller when you pass it to somebody else. Silence followed. Deep, heavy, honest. Boone slowly turned back around, his eyes red now, stripped completely of pride and defensiveness and uniform. The father. Just a flawed human being standing in the wreckage of his own choices. Miss Brooks, he said hoarsely. I was wrong about you before I ever spoke to you. Naomi looked at him calmly. You were wrong about yourself too. Boone's face crumpled slightly at the words, because somewhere deep down he knew they were